she is senior fellow in Carnegie's Endowment for International Peace. She is working or has been working for the Middle East program, focusing on Tunisia's political, economic, and security developments, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. We have Sharan Grual, also needs no introduction. Sharan has been an assistant professor of government, is also not fellow at the King's Institution and the President Senior Fellow at the POMED. Sharan has been working extensively on Tunisia for the past several years. And lastly, we have Shadi Hamid, is a very old and dear friend and has been working on democracy and democratization in the MENA region for many, many years, over a decade now. He's a specialist in the region and also on Islamic movements and Islamism in the region. Shadi is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings and an assistant research professor of Islamic Studies at Fuller Seminary. So, in terms of an introduction, brief introduction, I would say that all the experts and analysts of the Middle East and North Africa region agree that if there is one country in the entire MENA region where democracy has the best chance of success, it is Tunisia. That is why since the revolutions of 2011, almost 11 years ago, Tunisia has succeeded in building the first real democracy in the entire Arab world and was considered free and democratic by most international standards and organizations such as Freedom House, even though it did not succeed in achieving economic growth or prosperity. Then the corona pandemic happened in 2020 and 2021 and took a big chunk of the economy off. And then the elected president, Kais Saied, used this crisis, which he helped to create and magnify, to launch a coup against democracy on July 25, 2021. Since then, almost 10 months ago to the day, he has been seizing all the levers of power and dissolving all the independent institutions and branches of government, one after the other, and putting them under his control. Now, President Kais Saied is preparing to organize a referendum on July 25, in 2 months from today, on an as yet unknown and undisclosed constitution to be written by a committee of 5 or 6 people, deans of law school appointed solely by Kais Saied, followed by a national dialogue, followed or preceded, we're not really sure, by a national dialogue which excludes all political parties and includes only individuals and organizations who support what Kais Saied has been doing since last July. The elections will be organized under the supervision of an electoral commission handpicked by Kais Saied himself after he dissolved the independent commission, ISIE, and replaced or changed the law governing the ISIE by presidential decree. For the past 10 months, the US has been trying to convince Kais Saied to change course and urging him to restore democracy and to respect the constitution. But so far, he's not listening and is moving forward with imposing his vision and his new constitution, quote unquote, which will enshrine one-man rule for years and perhaps decades to come. So literally time is of the essence, because I think that if he succeeds in passing this so-called new constitution in 2 months from today, then he will have created a new legal framework and a new constitution that will be harder to undo. So I think that the next 2 months will be very critical in terms of restoring democracy. So the question that we are asking our panel to discuss today is, what should the US and the European Union do to signal their displeasure in a more forceful and clear way, and what can they do to help restore democracy in Tunisia? So these are the main questions that we want to discuss today. I think we will let Professor Sharan Grewal go first. Each panelist will have between 10 and 12 minutes to give us his or her opinion on what's going on in Tunisia today and on what the US and the EU should do to help restore democracy in Tunisia. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you speak Arabic, there is a simultaneous interpretation. All you have to do is click on the button interpretation at the bottom of the screen and pick the language that you want. In this case, it's either English or Arabic. And if you have a question, you can ask a question in one of three different ways: by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, by using the chat button, or by raising your hand, and we will try to give the microphone to few people at the end to ask questions and to have a wider discussion. So again, thank you, Larry, Sarah, Sharan, and Shadi for joining us today. Sharan, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you also for all that CSID has done over the past year. The events you've done with Ahmed Najib Shebbi, with Jawhar bin Mubarak, they have been incredibly helpful for keeping us informed about what's happening in Tunisia, hearing from the key players. So really, thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you.
So jumping right into the question, what can the US and the EU do to help restore democracy in Tunisia? In my mind, there are four possible approaches that I'll discuss in turn. The first would be rhetorical pressure and persuasion. In essence, the approach that the international community has taken from July 25th up until April. The second would be a partial suspension of assistance, which the US is embarking on now. The third would be a full suspension of aid. And then the fourth would be trying to leverage the IMF loan to help restore democracy. So let me discuss each of those in turn. So the first approach, the one that the international community has relied on so far, has been public statements expressing concern about Kais Saied's actions, as well as private meetings and calls with Kais Saied and those around him to try to convince them to be more inclusive and restore democratic institutions. And that approach, in essence, of rhetorical pressure without teeth, that was based in essence on three assumptions that the US and the EU had at the time of the coup. One, that this coup may have been popular. Second, that it wasn't quite clear where it had. Third, that as a result, through conversations with us, maybe we could shape the trajectory back to democracy. I think each of those three assumptions are now moot. In terms of popularity, even if it was popular at first, still minorities deserve rights, deserve political representation. We shouldn't condone a coup against a minority either. But I think what's become clear over the past months that the honeymoon period for Kais Saied is over. He's losing popularity in the polls. Tunisians are fed up with what he is trying to do. They don't see it as important to rewrite the constitution. They want economic growth, not a new political system. There are no signs that they are invested in the process that he is outlining, which all suggests that even if he has some popularity in polls today, he's not actually able to mobilize them towards his roadmap. Participate in the referendum, participate in the upcoming elections. Those are not the priority for Tunisians. So that first assumption about this being popular is, I think, now moot. The second one, that maybe we don't know where this is going, maybe it's short term, maybe he's restoring democracy. This, I think, is also clearly not the case. Instead, over the past 9 months, he's dismantled every democratic institution, from the parliament to the Supreme Judicial Council to the Independent Electoral Commission. He's handpicked a new electoral commission to provide some pseudo-legitimacy for the roadmap moving forward, but this is not an inclusive process that is boding well for a return for democracy. But now onto the third assumption that I think many still hold on to in the administration, which is that preserving some sort of relationship, therefore conversations with Kais Saied, could change his mind and restore democracy through persuasion. This, I think, we have seen in the past 9 months is not working. That on the one hand, you could argue maybe these meetings have curbed the most serious excesses, that, he hasn't yet dissolved parties, or he hasn't yet cut off US aid to NGOs. But I think we've also seen that there has been a rapid escalation over the last 9 months in terms of dissolving each of those institutions that I mentioned. So it's pretty clear that persuasion is not working, and thus that it's time to reassess what to do in Tunisia. And hence, we turn to the second option, which is the one that the US is now pursuing beginning in April, which is to begin a partial suspension of aid to Tunisia. And here I want to offer a bit of advice on how to make this work, how to get the maximum out of this strategy, if this is the strategy the international community will pursue. And here I want to draw on some lessons from Egypt in 2013, when the US also partially suspended aid after Sisi orchestrated a massacre of protesters. What went wrong there, and what lessons can be learned from that experience? The first is that to do a partial aid suspension well, it must be very clear what Tunisia needs to do for that aid to be reinstated. In Egypt, it wasn't quite clear what Sisi needed to do to get that aid back. The conditions were not quite made clear. Today, for Tunisia, Tony Blinken, Samantha Power have been quite good at making clear what an inclusive process looks like. They've specified that it needs to include political parties, CSOs, and labor unions, not just labor unions, for instance. They've been clear about expressing concern of military trials. I would say civilian trials against the opposition are also worrisome. But I think, in general, this could be made even more clear in terms of what he must do with the upcoming roadmap, namely specifying that international observers must be there to observe the referendum and parliamentary elections, that the electoral commission should be restructured so that it's actually independent and actually political parties therefore view the process as legitimate. Those conditions, I think, should be specified to make partial aid suspension actually work. The second lesson I think we would learn from Egypt is that not everyone in the administration was on the same page back then. At that point, the White House was in favor of cutting aid, but Secretary Kerry, to some extent Department of Defense, CIA, were all telling Sisi the opposite message, that there wasn't much he needed to do differently for aid to eventually get reinstated. And so in Tunisia's case, it's also clear that everyone in the administration be on the same page about what conditions are needed for aid to be reinstated. We've heard already from White House, State Department, USAID. We haven't yet heard from Department of Defense, and so I worry that perhaps DOD might undercut the effectiveness of this strategy if, for instance, they push for a national security waiver to reinstate the aid, or they increase other pools of funding to try to make up for the reduced FMF funding. So making sure everyone is on the same page would be the second lesson. The third lesson here for a partial aid suspension, and sorry I'm going on a bit long, is to make sure that it is viewed as a credible commitment, that the US is actually serious about not reinstating that aid until the conditions are met. And this is, I think, the critical condition to making an aid suspension work, which is that Sisi, for instance, in Egypt, understood that he didn't need to do much to get the aid reinstated, that he could hold a sham election with just 98% of the vote, and that would be enough. So the worry is that Kais Saied thinks the same, that he can just stick to his roadmap, maybe get one party or two to endorse the process, like the Jabhat al-Shabiya, the People's Movement, for instance, and that might be good enough. And so to make credible the US's commitment to an aid suspension, I would propose that, in essence, the US remove themselves from that decision by delegating it to a third party. In essence, say aid would only be reinstated if international observers actually confirm that this process has been free, fair, and inclusive. So in essence, delegate it to a third party to make it more credible that aid won't be reinstated until these conditions are actually met. All right. Two other strategies I want to briefly introduce, and I believe the other panelists will talk about these as well, which would be, first, a full suspension of aid. Here I see two major benefits to pursuing that. One, that it's a larger amount of aid, and so that's more likely, therefore, to shift Kais Saied's calculations. But secondly, that it allows the US, therefore, to declare that this was indeed a coup. Because of the coup clause, we haven't yet said it. That would mandate that any aid to the government be suspended. And so by fully suspending aid, we can call it a coup. Why is that important? I think two reasons. One, because it helps you make that credible commitment. Because of the coup clause, aid cannot be reinstated until there's a democratically elected government back in office. So that at least mitigates some of the commitment problems. But the second reason I think it's important to call it a coup is because it helps to delegitimize the action. Some of the research I've done, just published in Democratization, for instance, shows that if you call an action a coup, public support for it decreases. That survey that we did in Tunisia, for instance, found that 40% would support the military removing the president, but if you called that a coup, it dropped to 20%, a 20 percentage point drop. So that suggests that changing the narrative, calling it a coup, can help also for delegitimizing that action. Finally, let me get to the fourth policy approach, which would be to leverage the IMF negotiations and to add a condition there that a restoration of democracy is critical for the IMF process to proceed. The resistance to this proposal is in part from a belief that Kais Saied will finally be the one to pursue the economic reforms that the IMF has been hoping for the past 10 years, that he now has the popularity to, in essence, sell these reforms finally to the Tunisian public. And there's a belief that that might happen, and therefore the economic condition should be the one you focus on, not, for instance, political requirements for the IMF loan. But I think that hope is misplaced. I don't think Kais Saied is the one who's actually going to cut the subsidies to sell off the state-owned enterprises, etc. Partly because he's already losing popularity and so wouldn't want to jeopardize that further, but also because the main supporters he has left are, if we want to characterize them, not the Islamists, not the free market secularists. The main base he has left are the leftist, Arab nationalist, Nasserist types. The parties that are closest to him, for instance, Jabhat al-Shabiya, are of that stripe. And so he's not going to lose his main base left by pursuing these economic reforms. And so I would say instead, the more likely condition and the more effective condition would be to restore democracy instead. Finally, before I close, if I may, I just want to make one last point, both for the international community but also for the Tunisian opposition, which is that Kais Saied needs an off-ramp. He needs some way to still come off as having won, even while democracy gets restored. I think he does still need to have the referendum, pass the referendum, create a new republic so that he comes off as having a win, but still that is a new republic that all find legitimate and actually restores democracy. So I do think it's important for parties to come to the table and find a consensual negotiated solution out of this crisis. Let me stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sharan. That was excellent, really amazing presentation, very good summary of the situation and the various options I think that should be considered. So we now go to Sarah Yerkes. Good morning, Sarah. Good to see you again. Please go ahead. You have the floor for about 10 to 12 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And I will say I'm normally the optimist of most panels. I am not today. And I also generally agree a lot with my friend and colleague Sharan, but I'm going to disagree with a couple things very respectfully. But first of all, I think that there is no question that the US and Europe should and need to do more to pressure Saied to return Tunisia to a democratic path. I think at this point, and frankly, really from July 26th forward, there should be no question that Saied is taking Tunisia down an autocratic path. As Sean mentioned, he's systematically dismantled every independent institution, including the Constitution, and he's excluding all other voices other than his own from the political scene. And further, he's really basing his legitimacy on this false claim that he represents what the people want. But it's really clear from his hemorrhaging of support, the extremely low participation in the online, quote, consultation, as well as the growing number of public protests against him, that he does not actually represent the voice of the people. And even more importantly, he's not acting in a way that benefits the people. He's only acting in a way that benefits himself. His actions are actively harming Tunisia and preventing the sort of economic recovery the country desperately needs. So I think really importantly for any policymakers on the call, there's a really small but crucial window of opportunity before the July 25th referendum, which is in just about 2 months, for the international community to act. I think what we are likely to see from this new constitution is a lot of very troubling things that go very much against US and European interests, as well as, of course, Tunisian interests. First of all, consolidation power in the hands of the president. I mean, that one's no question. We'll see a weakened prime minister and parliament, possibly also the outlawing of political parties, or at least some of the current parties, restrictions against civil society, potentially the restriction of foreign funding of NGOs, and in the worst case scenario, the removing of presidential term limits or making President Saied the president for life. And I think we need to be really honest with ourselves here that this referendum is going to pass. If we look historically at constitutional referendums, and Larry, tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is generally constitutional referendums pass. And especially when you have a lot of political groups and civil society who are saying they're going to boycott the referendum, what you could end up with is very low turnout numbers, say 10% of people show up, but all Saied needs is to say that the majority of the people who voted yes. And that, in his mind, kind of makes him bulletproof. He can then say he's operating based on the will of the people according to this constitution, even if it's clear to all of us on the outside that this process was a total farce. So the international community needs to act now before we get to this point of this constitution being approved, being the new sort of set of laws that govern Tunisia. So what should we do? What should the US and Europe do? And I'm going to focus on the US because I sit in Washington and worked for the US government. So this is where I'm going to be contrarian. I think I disagree very strongly with the idea that cutting aid, especially fully suspending aid, is actually in the US interest or would be effective. And I think if you look historically at how USAID, not USAID, or maybe USAID too, but has been used as hasn't worked. And Sean and I are clearly on the same wavelength because I'm going to point to Egypt too here. I just have to caveat with that. I know Tunisia is not Egypt. He knew what he needed to do to get back on track. But he also knew, and I think he was absolutely right, that the importance of Egypt to the United States was superseded any of those conditions, any of the things he had to make. He knew whether or not, and I agreed, Secretary Kerry did not, it was actually, State Department was pushing against calling it a coup. They were the biggest voice pushing against it. The Pentagon was sort of wavering and eventually said they didn't want to do it either. But Sisi knew that Egypt was never going to be a place the U.S. abandoned. We were always going to maintain our relationship with them, so he could just ignore the conditions. That's not the same in Tunisia. Tunisia has a very different relationship with the United States. The other thing that's a little bit different, I think, is that Egypt clearly was a military coup. I mean, there's no question, if you look at the definition of a military coup, that was it. But what we need to remember when it comes to whether or not we call Tunisia a coup is that the language that triggers suspension of U.S. aid is about military coups. And that's not the case in Tunisia. I mean, I've been saying it's a coup since day one. I clearly believe it's a coup. It's not a military coup. It's a self-coup. And so even if the United States were to come out, if every U.S. actor were to say, this is a coup, this is a self-coup, it wouldn't do anything legally for assistance to Tunisia. I just want to kind of lay that out, which is why I'm not really taking a position on whether the U.S. should be calling it a coup or not, because I don't think it really matters, frankly. I think it helps when we say it, but I don't think it really legally makes a difference. But going back to Egypt, why I think that this shows us that cutting aid is not a great idea. First of all, when the U.S. did cut Egypt based on cut aid to Egypt based on Sisi's human rights violations, Sisi actually doubled down on repression. He didn't stop it. It made no influence on actual repression against the people, which the aid suspension was supposed to stop. But more importantly to that, when this aid package was cut, and let's remember too, this is $1.3 billion compared to about $100 million in U.S. military assistance to Tunisia, so way more leverage than we have in Tunisia. Egypt didn't suffer. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, Egypt's Gulf friends, stepped in with nearly 10 times as much assistance as the U.S. package that was cut. So this goes to my first point of why this shouldn't work in Tunisia. The U.S. is not the only game in town. I think the amounts here are quite small, and cutting that assistance opens the door for Russia and the Gulf states to fill in the U.S. void, neither of which is in the U.S. interest or in the interest of protecting Tunisia's democracy. We've seen media reports lately about Saied cozying up to Russia, more cooperation with Russia, potentially visiting Moscow. Russia needs friends right now, and Tunisia could easily become one of them. I think it's highly conceivable that if the U.S. decides we're going to fully suspend military aid or even partially suspend aid, that Russia could fill in that gap very easily. Again, the amounts are not that big. That would take away the U.S. leverage they have with the military, and if we're talking about fully cutting aid, take away a lot of our leverage. There's also reports that Saied has been asking President Sisi to pressure the Gulf to give Tunisia assistance. Now, that's not as likely to come to fruition. The Gulf so far has been rhetorically supporting Tunisia, but hasn't actually put any money where their mouth is. But I think we should also just kind of keep that in the back of our minds. The second reason is that cutting military aid could actually hurt Tunisian security. Now, Tunisia is a major non-NATO ally of the United States and a strong security partner. U.S. security assistance has been very effective, and while the military has many problems, there are lots of things that still need to evolve. Tunisia continues to face real security challenges, including terrorism and instability on both borders in Libya and Algeria, and that instability represents a direct threat to the security of the United States and Europe. So cutting that aid to pressure Saied, I think, is a little bit like cutting off your nose to spite your face. On the economic side, cutting aid is directly counter to the goal of improving the lives of Tunisians. Tunisia is facing dire economic situation, is in critical need of economic assistance. I think taking away that assistance right now would be counterproductive, and it wouldn't actually harm Saied himself, it would harm the Tunisian people. But the most important reason why I think cutting assistance is not a good idea is that nothing Saied has done over the past 10 months suggests he would be swayed by cuts to U.S. assistance. I think the reaction we've seen so far to these sort of sticks is that he's been lashing out, not acquiescing. And I think, frankly, it's naive to expect that holding $100 million U.S. assistance is enough of a victim for Saied change. Now, at the top, I want to give a different one. I think it's more likely to be effective and helps rather than hurt. So I have two, maybe these are controversial. It's the first time I'm saying this out loud, so maybe everyone will attack me and tell me I'm wrong. But I think the first thing I would say is to keep aid levels the same as they've been in the past, but rejigger that assistance to better assist in return to democracy. So the first way to do that is to take away any direct assistance from Tunisia, government not the U.S. dollar until he returns Tunisia to a democratic path. And here, you can take that assistance that's currently going to the Tunisian government and instead give it to civil society, political parties, and the media, who's increasingly under threat. We have this window of opportunity that I mentioned. If the NGO law changes go through, similar to what we saw in Egypt, it will be very, very difficult for the U.S. to continue to support civil society. We have strong civil society partners on the ground, so I think we should double down on our support to them. This also sends a clear signal to Saied and to civil society actors and those fighting for democracy where U.S. priorities are, and it helps actors fighting for democracy. On the military front, I would say cut any aid to the Ministry of Interior. Focus instead on Ministry of Defense, on training related to military justice, working with the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. We clearly need to address this issue of using military courts to try civilians, so keep U.S. funds flowing towards that end. Help with training, help with getting it out, getting that message out, that we'll keep funding the military, but only if you go through and you fulfill these certain criteria that we've talked about. And also keep funds out of the hands of the police who've been engaging in brutality. The second point here is that rather than establishing punitive measures, which I don't think have worked so far and are not likely to work in the future, is to use carrots. So things that reward Saied for good behavior. I think both Secretaries Blinken and Administrator Power said that should Tunisia return to a democratic path, quote, our support can increase. I think this is a good path to take, but the amounts that are currently at stake, about 100 million, are not enough to sway Saied. You need additional pots of money, additional sweeteners that can help encourage him to get Tunisia back to a democracy. So I think, I agree with the idea of conditioning a new IMF loan on democratic reforms. That's been in the IMF talks for months. But you need to offer much more substantial pots, such as one idea is to make clear that the $500 million Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, which is currently in vote, needs to be conditioned on the return of a freely and fairly elected parliament. And as Ron mentioned, we need to have actual people who determine this thing is free and fair. Saied has said that he's not allowed to allow outside observers. But the U.S. needs to make sure this is not just a box-checking exercise to say, okay, they held elections in December, they have a parliament, they can get that money. No, this needs to actually be determined by a freely and fairly elected parliament. You can also put forward some substantial pots of money as direct budget to support to Tunisia should Saied return Tunisia to a democratic path. That's not on the table right now in the U.S. I think it should be. And other carrots that are much lower cost, such as diplomatic carrots, invite Tunisia to participate in the Summit for Democracy follow-on activities. From my understanding, Saied was not happy to be excluded from last year's event. That actually really upset him. So throw that out as a carrot. If you do these things that we mentioned, you can come back. We'll allow you to participate in that forum. Invite President Saied to visit the White House, again, if he does this. Publicly praise positive action. These are all low-cost actions that I think are much more likely to be effective than the sticks that we've put forward so far. And finally, I completely agree with Sharon, we need to have very clear benchmarks. So far, the U.S. has been really reactive. We need to see clear lines, clear benchmarks. I think these should be public benchmarks so that the Tunisian people are aware of what they are, as well as U.S. citizens, for Tunisia to be able to meet to open up these new streams of aid or diplomatic support. This can't just be return Tunisia to a democratic path or have an inclusive process. You need very, very clear lines so that Saied can see when he's met them and Tunisian people can see when he's met them. And I'll just close by saying, I think that overall, continuing to support Tunisian civil society and the Tunisian people is in the U.S. national security interest as well as the morally right thing to do. But conversely, going forward with aid cuts that I think are likely to change the dynamics on the ground could really diminish leverage in the region and lead to further instability and economic pain that could harm the people the assistance is designed to help. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Certainly we have some differing opinions here that hopefully we will have a chance to discuss. We now go to Shadi Hamid. Welcome back, Shadi. Good to see you again. Please go ahead. You have 10 to 12 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Radwan, for having me. Good to be back at a CSID event. So let me just start off by saying that basically 9 months have been lost. The conversation that we're having now, it's a bit frustrating because it's almost the same conversation I think we should have been having literally 9 months ago. And there were some of us, including Radwan, who almost immediately the day after were saying that this is either close to a coup, heading to a coup, or already a coup. And I think that there's a real sense of urgency in light of the fact that these 9 months have passed. So if there's any time to act, the time is going to be now. I'd put the window, as others have alluded to, at really the next few months. So we're having this conversation part because we can't wait, we can't be patient, we can't wait and see, we shouldn't wait and see. The time for action is now, and if we're not going to do something now, we should pretty much call it quits and expect Tunisia to move towards dictatorship on a, perhaps a semi-permanent level, at least for the coming years. Now, and I remember in those first couple days after Kais Saied's July power grab, it felt like deja vu, because I was on Twitter. Perhaps people thought I was doing it somewhat prematurely, but writing and calling out for a suspension of aid and suspension of IMF talks last year. People said, "Oh, Shadi, you're thinking too much about Egypt. Tunisia isn't Egypt. We Tunisians will never let Tunisia become an authoritarian regime. We're special, we're different, so on and so forth." Of course, this is the same thing Egyptians said in 2013. Yes, Shadi, we know that you're going on about the academic literature on coups and how our coup is supposedly textbook coup, but we Egyptians, we're special, we're different. We won't let this happen in the way it's happened in other places. At some level, you can't argue with history, you can't argue with the record, and not to say that political science is completely a science, but when we have a lot of evidence over dozens of cases, over decades, we know what a coup is when we see it, and then we act accordingly, and we don't give in to this idea that Tunisians are going to be different or that Egyptians are going to be different. And now we have confirmation 9 months later that Tunisians are not immune to the same things that other countries and peoples have fallen victim to. Now, on the question of aid, quite frankly, at this point, a partial aid suspension, it's nice symbolically, but there's a part of me that almost wonders, either we don't do an aid cut at all, or we do the full thing. What we know historically, particularly in the Middle East, is that partial aid cuts simply don't work. And this is where I take a different lesson than Sarah. What we tried in Egypt, the reason that it failed was that not only was it partial, it was incredibly partial. And I just went back to make sure I had the numbers right. According to a POMED report from a few years back, which looked at the 18-month suspension period in Egypt, Egypt still received $1.8 billion in assistance during that year-and-a-half period. That represented 92% of the $1.3 billion per year annual rate. In other words, the partial suspension wasn't 50%, it wasn't 25%, it wasn't 15%. It was only 8%. So that's the problem when you try to split the middle and you try to be very surgical and you move things around. First of all, you dilute your message. People don't actually know what's going on. It's hard to follow the actual nature of a suspension, where even I remember U.S. officials were confused about their own suspension, about what it actually meant. And then, of course, John Kerry made that very memorable remark where after the suspension, he said to the Minister of Foreign Affairs counterpart in Egypt, he said, basically, the aid issue is a very little issue. He used the actual word, very little issue. He made very clear that, hey guys, don't worry about this. So there's always a risk that once you introduce these complex aid mechanisms, that the assumption is going to be that you can somehow get around it through various means. Now, that said, I'm sympathetic to the idea that aid cuts are not the answer, they're not the only answer, and that's why Sharon and we wrote a piece in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago where we called for what we call the maximalist option, something that is rarely used. Sharon talked about it. It's using the IMF talks as our primary lever. Now, the reason we don't use this all that often is because we like to pretend that the IMF doesn't do politics, and that the IMF doesn't care if a government is authoritarian or democratic. So, and then also in the IMF Articles of Agreement, there's nothing specifically about having to be a democracy or having political reforms or all that stuff. So that's why we don't tend to like doing that, because it's a little bit, it seems a little bit messy. But the U.S. does have, along with its European partners, the ability to suspend IMF talks. The U.S. and its European partners are the largest shareholders in the IMF, meaning that they can use their voting rights to compel IMF officials to suspend talks. That is not unrealistic. It's not implausible. It's 100% plausible. All you need is political will. The U.S. can do it. It's just a question of whether at the highest levels of the U.S. government they're willing to move in that direction and to bring at least some of their European partners on board. There may be a couple European partners who will be harder to get on board. Unfortunately, our friend Emmanuel Macron is known to have a soft spot for dictators, so that would be perhaps more challenging. But still, it can be done, and it's a political will issue and not a practicality issue. And this kind of more clear, full-throated approach is preferable for some of the reasons I just mentioned, but also for other reasons that anything in between, the split-the-middle approaches run the risk of basically, as Sarah suggested, alienating Kais Saied without actually getting him to change. This is always the challenge with leverage. You really have to decide to use it to the fullest extent possible. Otherwise, you're in this in-between space where you essentially alienate both sides. A partial aid suspension, or even going further than a partial aid suspension, but not touching the IMF talks, it still runs the risk of going further, but not far enough. And then you end up basically sending a message to pro-democracy activists that you're willing to do something, but not enough. And then you're also sending the message to Kais Saied that you're undermining his rule and you're annoying him and irritating him, but you're not actually going to that next level where you have the most powerful lever. And that lever ultimately is about the IMF. Why? Because Kais Saied is in a very dangerous economic situation. Tunisia is at risk of historic default. Tunisia's credit rating was recently downgraded. And it's not just about the IMF support. IMF support also opens up other credit lines. It opens up other financial avenues. It also sends a signal to the international community that Tunisia is open for foreign investment, that it's not too risky, and that the international community will ensure that the Tunisian economy perhaps not prospers, but at least survives and, lives to fight another day. So the IMF in that sense is the opening for Tunisia's economy. And that's why, various, former Tunisian officials Sharon and I have talked to have always come back to this. Tunisia needs an IMF bailout. And this gets me, I think, to a broader point, is that we misunderstand our leverage. We always do this, I think, in the Middle East, is Tunisia needs the U.S. and Tunisia needs the U.S. much more than we need them. I mean, it's not even really close. And to be so tiptoeing around Kais Saied in order not to annoy him or think that he can actually do better or be better, I think it suggests a fundamental misreading of the situation and a fundamental misreading of the fact that Kais Saied is in a weak position. Also, there's a naivete in thinking that private diplomacy can ever work with someone like this. If you're an autocrat, you're an autocrat. saying nice things to them, encouraging them, giving them carrots, whatever it might be, you can't, it assumes a kind of good faith interlocutor. It assumes a good faith partnership where if you show that you're saying and doing the nice thing to them, that they're going to reciprocate. Unfortunately, this goes against most of what we know about human nature. They're going to see that as a sign of weakness, that we're coming to them and we want it to work and we're trying to find a way to use private diplomacy to, we've tried this before in the Middle East. It doesn't work with autocrats, and we know that Kais Saied is not a Democrat. He said this very explicitly before. As we mentioned in our Washington Post piece, he had this memorable quote where he said quite literally, "I don't believe in representative democracy." At some point, you take people at their word and you don't try to see the good in them. They have told us who they are. And that's why, that's one of the reasons I think that there's relatively little we can do in terms of the approach where we encourage and we try to be nice to Kais Saied. The final thing I'll say is, the fact that this is happening now is interesting. It's happening under the auspices of the Biden administration. Now, the Biden administration has said, in a way that I think is quite good, that the struggle between democracy and autocracy is the defining struggle of our time. At least rhetorically, they've oriented their foreign policy along these lines. I don't want to say that this is a grand strategy per se, because I don't think it's really been fleshed out, but the rhetoric has been repeated time and time again, and it's actually intensified since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And understandably so. Russia is an authoritarian regime and it's invading a democratic country in Ukraine. Now, what's frustrating about all of this is that you would have thought that with the growing emphasis on democracy as an organizing principle in U.S. foreign policy, that there would be some spillover effect and it would influence our policy in the Middle East at least a little bit. There has been nothing of the sort. Let's be very clear about what this is. This is Middle East exceptionalism. The only way to interpret this is that we think democracy is good for other regions and other peoples. We don't believe it applies to the Middle East. We carve out the Middle East as an exception, whatever reason it might be. We don't have to go into that too much, but there is a presumption that the Middle East cannot become less authoritarian. It cannot become more democratic. Perhaps there is something wrong with Arabs themselves. I don't want to read too much into the psychoanalysis about some. The administration might think about it, but we have to be very clear that this is what's going on now. So it's up to, I think, the rest of us to say that if this is going to be the central struggle of our time, as the Biden administration says, the only way it's a central struggle is if it applies to all regions. It's not a central struggle if we're exempting one of the most strategic regions in the world, a region that still matters. Maybe it doesn't matter as much as China or Russia, and people don't pay attention to it as much anymore. But I think it's still fair to say that the Middle East is at least somewhat important. It's a big region. A lot of people live there. And if we really think democracy is right and good on this broader strategic level, I don't think that people should or can believe in us when we say that if we don't include the Middle East into that broader agenda.
Thank you, Shadi. Thank you very much. Now, the last presentation, or final presentation by our friend and colleague and really scholar of democracy, I guess in the whole world, Professor Larry Diamond. Please go ahead, Larry. You have 10 to 12 minutes. Put it in international context for us, please.
Well, and then I'll have some very specific things to say. The most important thing I have to say is thank you so much, Radwan. I mean, this has just been a phenomenally lucid, compelling, interesting, and important set of presentations. I just I'm glad you asked me to speak so that I was sure to listen, because I have just learned so much already. I do want to respond immediately to Shadi in this sense. Don't be too offended by the Biden administration's lack of attention to or priority on defending democracy and democratic struggles in the Middle East. Because if you look carefully at the other parts of the world, frankly, it has fallen short in many regions of the world, not just the Middle East. There is a deeply, alarmingly authoritarian drift in India. President Biden is meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's presiding over, a degree of religious chauvinism, extremism, and punishment of the Muslim minority and other religious minorities in India. And the Muslim minority constitutes one of the largest Muslim populations of any country in the world. And I predict you're going to hear not a peep of public and probably little in the way of private expression of concern about India's drift away from democracy and any kind of respect for religious and other minority rights, including academic freedom, the rights of political opposition, and so on. You just had Ferdinand Marcos Jr. elected president of the Philippines. The whole ASEAN region has been tilting away from democracy. Can you recall hearing much Biden administration declaration of concern about that? I don't see this as Middle East exceptionalism. I see this as a very big gap between the lofty goals and principles of the vague and ill-defined democracy summit process and the hard realities of diplomacy, which have gotten, of course, a lot harder since Russia invaded Ukraine, and our political capital has shrunk because, like our military, literally our military inventories, we need to use so much of it in this critical battle. So I share your moral concern, one in this panel, that there should be no Middle East exceptionalism, that our goal should be the defense of human rights and the advance of democracy for all peoples everywhere in the world. But the Middle East is not the only region that's disappointed. Let's put it that way. I think Tunisia within the MENA region it is just absolutely critical. There are very few countries in the world, if any, that have a strategic importance for the future of democracy so out of proportion to their population size. I'd say the one other I could think of is Taiwan, which is a threatened democracy externally, not internally. But it is the country that's got the best chance of being a democracy and a real democracy with significant liberal elements. This coup didn't need to happen. And the first substantive point I want to make about Tunisia itself is this should have been declared a coup a long time ago. And what Sarah said, which is what I thought was the case last year, but then everyone was, well, we declared a coup and it triggered automatic aid cutoffs, underscores why we shouldn't have had any hesitation about doing it, as, maybe not in the week after, but as his intentions became clearer and clearer. And I think by late 2021, they were pretty clear, precisely because it doesn't, that the law refers to military coups. I think the moral and geopolitical importance of declaring it a coup really generated an imperative here for the United States. First of all, I forget who said it, but I think it was Sharon, maybe it was Sarah, that there's a demonstration impact, there's a signaling impact within the society that it was Sharon. It does help to undermine the legitimacy of the actor who has staged the coup if you call out in very clear terms what he has done and where he is going. Secondly, if we don't do it here, what does it mean for our credibility in potentially calling a spade elsewhere in the world and acting to reverse democratic regression elsewhere in the world? We are in a very deep and accelerating, I won't even call it democratic recession anymore, severe near depression of democracy in the world. We're on the cusp of a third reverse wave of democratic failures. And if in the face of something that is now becoming so blatant in terms of what Kais Saied is doing to dismantle democratic institutions, we can't even clearly declare what has happened, I think this is going to have extremely significant and harmful effects for our credibility as an international actor defending against democratic reversals. Now, let me say a few things about what I think we should do. And I'm not sure that the distance between Sarah and Sharon and by extension then Shadi perhaps is as great as it may have sounded. Because the cutoff of aid, of government to government aid, that's a pretty serious thing. And I think the idea of conditioning, which it has to be conditioned. It's very clear that you have to, meet certain democratic standards to receive Millennium Challenge account assistance. So that's not even, that's just taking the spirit of the Millennium Challenge account seriously to put that as an explicit guidepost for going ahead with a major Millennium Challenge account compact with Tunisia. And I agree as well that when you make this conditioning public, it has a signaling effect that is very healthy and very important. So I actually think, my heart, is with what Sharon said. I'm really outraged by what Saied has done and is doing. But I think the idea of just taking the whole block of existing assistance and moving it, redirecting it to civil society is an extremely clever idea. And I don't know what proportion of that aid is now directed toward small and medium enterprises in Tunisia. But I would put a lot of emphasis on that. It seems to me that you can really reach down into Tunisian society and help to jumpstart a new kind of economy if we could make a long-term commitment toward cultivating, training, and perhaps with small lending that, some kind of new vehicle for that could be directed towards small, medium enterprises in Tunisia. And all of these ways signal that we feel a long-term stake in Tunisia, and with the Tunisian people, our goal should be to separate the regime from the people and to signal our long-term solidarity with the Tunisian people. Let me say as well, private diplomacy, yes, is, I think, counterproductive when it's just carrots, it's just beseeching, it's just wishing and hoping. But when it's carrots and sticks, it's not just being nice to them. The goal of private diplomacy can be and should be to manipulate their cost-benefit analysis. And here, I would send a high-level envoy to Saied, someone who clearly is carrying the full moral and geopolitical authority of the President of the United States. If that person could be accompanied by someone from the EU or an EU partner, even better, but the lift in doing what I'm about to do for the EU would be stronger, would be a more substantial lift. But I think we should lay out to Saied everything we're willing to do to help and elevate Tunisia and make him a successful president for the remainder of his term. Maybe even will help him get reelected again if he does specific democratic things. And high among them is not only holding a free and fair election, but there simply has to be a credible and independent electoral administration if there's going to be a free and fair election, but also making very clear to him what's going to happen if he goes down the current path. And I think part of what needs to be said about what's going to happen if he goes down the current path is a very specific list of targeted sanctions, financial sanctions, personal sanctions on travel and so on, that's going to come down on him and the Tunisian elites supporting him if he goes ahead to institutionalize this authoritarian coup. I've got two last points. Number one, actually, Sarah, you are not correct that constitutional referendums always win. That is simply not true. The defeat of Pinochet's authoritarian constitution in a referendum was a major landmark decision that triggered a transition back to democracy. And there was, at least I think it was in Bolivia, another recent instance where, an authoritarian populace tried to foist a new constitution on the society and lost. But there's a crucial condition for success, and that is people have to participate. And I think we should urge our interlocutors and partners in Tunisian civil society to not boycott the constitutional referendum. Go in saying, look, we think this is, the ground rules are not free and fair. We go in protesting, but election boycotts almost always fail. And that's a more general proposition that I would make. And then try and get as much monitoring of the process as possible. But massive mobilization for a no vote in the referendum, I think, should be what we encourage. And then finally, I think there is another way of doing deliberation that could make a difference. And that is, we've been doing deliberative polls at Stanford University in lots of countries around the world. And I think that if you just bring a random sample of Tunisians together to deliberate on the country's plight and different constitutional options and inform them in advance in a neutral and fair way about the costs and benefits of different constitutional options, that could be a way of getting a public deliberation in Tunisia that would actually be very democratic. And you could even, do it online, so people could deliberate using their mobile phones or something like that. That's all.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you all for excellent presentations. We now have about 30 minutes for Q&A. We have a lot of questions. I want to remind our audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A button or using the Q&A button. They can ask questions in the chat section or by by raising the hand. Before I start the Q&A section, just want to make a brief comment about support for civil society that was suggested by at least Larry and Sarah. I want to say that as a president of an NGO myself, of course, I would welcome support for NGOs and civil society in Tunisia. But I must also say that I've been very, very disappointed in the role that civil society played in Tunisia since the coup. They've been either silent, completely silent, I guess because they are worried and afraid that they'll be persecuted or shut down or something like that. And in some cases, they've been supportive of the coup, which is really shocking that many organizations that have received millions of dollars from the US and the EU in the past years to support democracy and defend democracy have come out in support of the coup in the weeks and months after July 25. So I think we really need to be careful about supporting civil society and which civil society organizations we support. And I think in this particular time, I don't think that civil society has the strength really to stand up to Kais Saied, because afraid and genuinely afraid. I have many friends in several NGOs in Tunis who are telling me that, you know, that they are afraid that they'll be arrested or shut down, you know, completely if they speak up against the coup. So I think we have to be realistic in terms of what civil society really can do. But my other comment and really a question that I ask to all of you is on the role of the military, which to me is really has been what's disappointing about all of this. The Tunisian military historically has always stayed out of politics, historically from independence from 1956 up until this coup in 2011. This is what was really surprising and shocking, that they followed Kais Saied's order to shut down the parliament. Until today, there are 2 tanks in front of the parliament shutting down the parliament. And in addition to military courts trying several members of parliament and several opposition leaders, several lawyers, and several bloggers and journalists being tried by military courts. So my question to all of you, and maybe Sharan, because I think you've been focusing a lot on the military role in Tunisia and the cooperation between the US and Tunisian military, is why can't we have more leverage on the military? You know, why can't we make it clear to them that if they want to be allies with the United States, and by the way, I do think that the Tunisian military cares deeply about its relationship with the US military, unlike Kais Saied, who perhaps does not care that much. But why can't we explain to them that what they're doing is illegal, is unconstitutional, and that if they expect their special relationship and special non-NATO member strategic ally status to continue, that they have to revert to staying neutral in political matters? Sharan, do you have an answer to that question, or maybe Sarah also?
Just a couple of thoughts, if I may, on the role of the Tunisian military. I agree with you that the actions they have taken over the last year suggest that, yes, they do support the coup. The agreement to follow that order to close the parliament suggests that, yes, are supportive of the coup. On the one hand, they could say that, hey, we're just following orders. In that sense, we're still neutral or apolitical. But the order itself was unconstitutional. And professionalism dictates that you refuse an unconstitutional order. And we should mention that the Tunisian military has previously refused unconstitutional orders in the past, suggesting that if it didn't this time, that indicates some degree of support for what has happened. And so I think the U.S. should exert more leverage over the Tunisian military to convince them that the way this is headed is not good for the Tunisian military. I think one thing that the U.S. military is learning is that civilians politicizing the military, trying to get the military involved in supporting what the president is doing, hurts the military. It hurts trust in the military. It hurts the military's public image. And I think if that message is sent from a mil-mil level, U.S. military to Tunisian military, that could be quite effective. Likewise, I think the U.S. military DoD plays an important role for actually leveraging the military aid and convincing the Tunisian military don't continue supporting this coup because we know we both value this military-to-military relationship, and the way to preserve that is letting the parliament, for instance, reopen. If I may address two other points before we turn it over. Sure. One is this question about the coup clause in the U.S. And I think we've already seen a little discussion in the chat. I think Larry picked up on this as well, that although this is not a military coup, this is a presidential coup, self-coup, etc., I think there's two ways to respond. One is that the coup clause itself has changed a bit over time. Alexis Arieff, who I think is one of the panelists, has recently written about how it did get updated from previously being narrowly about military coups to now being about coups generally or decrees in which the military plays a role. They certainly did in this case, but yes, it is not against the president, it is in favor of the president. But the point here I want to make is that that is also an important signal to send moving forward, that presidential coups also result in aid suspensions, especially since presidential coups are becoming more common over time, almost more common in the past 2 decades than military coups, more common in terms of democratic backsliding. It would be important to send that precedent moving forward. The final point I want to make is I think the most persuasive reason for not cutting aid or leveraging the IMF loan, which is the fear that other countries are going to jump in, whether it's the Gulf, Saudi, UAE, or it's China, or it's Russia, that there is some fear that letting Tunisia go is going to push them towards these other countries. And what we've seen over the past year is that Algeria stepped in a bit, providing $300 million loan to Tunisia. There's rumors that Saudi helped a bit as well, but otherwise it's been peanuts. Tunisia is in crisis. They need money to fund the budget, yet these other countries have not stepped in. And so I find it unlikely they will step in more if the U.S. were to start to put a bit more pressure. The other thing I would say is that let that additional funding come. Tunisia needs it. Tunisians need that funding wherever it comes from. I don't think it's going to give those countries leverage over the Tunisian government. It's not as if our funding to them is really giving us any leverage over Kais Saied's actions. And so I would I think downplay this fear that other countries are going to step in and to say that we should use this leverage that we have, having built it up for a decade or more in Tunisia.
Thank you. Sarah?
Sure. I don't really have too much to add on the military coup question. I think Sean makes a really good point that, if we were to call this a coup and start to set that precedent that self-coups, presidential coups can also trigger aid suspensions. I think that's a great idea. I tend to sort of think it's too late or a little bit, that this should have been done, so like I said, early on. And also we need to figure out, what point did it become a coup? At what point do we decide? And maybe that is after the referendum if things change. But, sort of, I want to respond a little bit to some of the other points that were made. And I think, as I said, I agree that the IMF should be used. It's already being used. The U.S. has been using the IMF as leverage since day one of the IMF talks. They've been, if you talk to the folks who are in the room in those discussions, they will tell you they've been putting that forward and it has not worked. So while I think we still should keep, the IMF is a huge piece of leverage. Blinken mentioned it in his April 28th testimony. I think it's a good idea. I also don't think it's sufficient for us to pressure Saied. And so I would love to hear from the folks in this call of how do you see this playing out? I guess, maybe I'm being too, maybe trying to do carrots is not a good idea. I agree with how Larry characterized it. Still push. The idea of the carrots is not that you only are nice to Saied. The idea is that you're trying to push him in a way, that's different from what we've been doing so far that has absolutely failed, to get him to do something else that also helps the Tunisian people. And so I guess my question, and I'm maybe not supposed to be asking questions, but I think that the question is, so say we cut all our aid, say call off the IMF talks, IMF's not giving any money. What happens? In my mind, what happens is Tunisians literally starve because you have this massive food crisis that's being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. You have people who are angrier. All the factors that led to Saied being able to take over power on July 25th get much worse, not to mention the factors that led to the revolution that were never addressed in the past 10 years. I don't see how any of those factors leads us to a more stable and democratic Tunisia, or leads us to good results for the Tunisian people. And so I guess I'm curious of how all these punitive measures get us there. I'm at this point, I'm very jaded where I just don't believe Saied is going to, the way you get rid of him is through potentially a presidential election when his term ends. Maybe he won't even allow for that. But if you do, as Larry said, create the conditions that he is willing to actually roll back some of these, prevent this constitution from being a complete, authoritarianization of Tunisia, ensure that there are some patches in that constitution to allow at least some modern democracy to happen over the next couple months, have a parliament come in, have him elections when he actually has to hold the elections, and get someone else by time to actually get a new government. Maybe, I'm just at a total loss of what is that exit ramp? How do you actually move things forward without really hurting the Tunisian people in the long run, or in the short run, I should say?
What about our military?
I agree with Sean. I think that the message should be that, if you are a U.S. partner, you have to abide by certain things. But again, at this point of very really militaries, and I'm not sure what pressure we're willing to use at this point. And I think that, we do have the Leahy laws that, if there are human rights violations that are done by a military that we find, that can trigger also cuts to assistance. So that's why, I really think just in general, rejiggering our aid, taking this moment, and maybe it's too late, we only have 2 months, but taking this moment to say, we can't just keep business as usual. We can't just keep funding the same groups and people the same way that we've been funding them. So it's not benefiting Tunisia, and it's not benefiting the United States. We need to figure out a better way to do this, fund people that are actually acting in our interest. And that's how working with the military on some of these. We have a lot of experience in training on, Sharon knows this space better than I do, but on security sector reform, trying to train the military not to use courts to try civilians, things like that. We could work with them, make that a condition of continuing assistance.
Shadi, you have something to say about this?
Yeah, just to put a sharper point on some of this. Well, first of all, I have to disagree a bit with Sarah. We have not actually used the IMF lever up until this point. That's not accurate. We have not suspended IMF talks, IMF negotiations. It's still been on the table. What we're talking about is suspending talks if certain conditions aren't met. So it's not as if we would just suspend them unilaterally without any further explanation. We would say that we will move in this direction of suspending talks unless certain benchmarks and conditions are met relatively soon, whether that's in a month, 2 months, whatever it happens to be. We can get into specifics. And then if those conditions aren't met, then IMF talks will be completely suspended, and that talks about talks and anything having going forward on the IMF that is not used up until this point. And I would just also say, like, on military aid specifically, there is, in my view, there is no prospect of Tunisia moving to Russia or China. Our allies always come up with this as a way to basically, impress on our emotions and to make us feel that we have to stick with them through thick and thin, it is very difficult to shift your allegiance militarily from the U.S. to Russia. Also, let's be clear, a declining power, that's a bit of a joke militarily. China also, in my view, a declining power because it's an authoritarian regime, and authoritarian regimes tend to be inherently unstable, as we're seeing now with their COVID restrictions. So I would just say that, and there's also the fact that in the last 11 years, we've given, I think, close to the full amount of our military assistance to Tunisia is at hundreds of millions. It's maybe getting close to $1 billion. So there's also the prestige factor in terms of the relationship with the best military in the world. If you're actually saying that the military might have to rely on Russian support, first of all, I'm not really familiar with recent examples where that's happened. It's very difficult to do because of the interoperability of weapon systems, maintenance, spare parts. The equipment that we've been giving to Tunisia can't run on Russian or Chinese support. They'd have to completely reorient their geopolitical position. And if you want to cast your lot with China and Russia at this point, good luck to you. But I think that we shouldn't fall into this. We have to call their bluff on this because they're using that threat to try to manipulate us.
Thank you, Shadi. Larry, do you have something to add on this question of the military and the role of the military?
Just briefly, what Shadi said resonates with me. I had a similar reaction. The idea that Tunisia is going to turn to Russia militarily. It's just, I mean, Russia is so overextended now, and the Russian military is in such a state of stress and disarray that if it would have been plausible, it doesn't seem very plausible right now. I do think, you know, a lot of this, I realize there's, anyone who's been in government knows there is so much truth in the old adage that the devil is in the details. And what looks clear and compelling from the outside may be less obvious or more complicated when you peel away a lot of layers and get to the underlying reality. I think this is part of what Sarah was trying to say. And so I also, you know, I know what I don't know. And I don't know what the Tunisian military is thinking or what they believe. But I know from other cases that that two things are true, and that the two things push in terms of the recommendations for the moment in opposite directions, and how we reconcile these two things is part of both the pain and the art of foreign policy. One thing that is true is that when the military has the integration and the kind of psychological and geopolitical orientation toward partnership with, training by, supply from the United States, we have a lot of leverage. That was Shadi's point. And, you know, we don't want to underutilize our leverage. But the other thing that's true is that when the boom is lowered in a decisive way, and all of this training and integration is severed, it sets in train a new set of dynamics, and it can take a long time to recover. So I think this requires just a very, very careful weighing of and benefits of our strengths and vulnerabilities, and reciprocally with the Tunisian military. But one thing that's clear to me is, like, as I said, we should be trying to separate Saied from the Tunisian people. We should also be trying to separate him from the Tunisian military. and making clear to the military that the more they act as a professional military and not an enforcer of an illegal seizure of power, the more the relationship they value with the United States militarily can be preserved.
Thank you very much. Now we have 11 questions in the Q&A section. I'm going to read them very quickly all together, and you as panelists can pick and choose which which questions you want to answer, because I don't think we have a lot of time to answer all of them, but you can pick 1 or 2 or 3 questions that you want to answer. So, former Ambassador Herman Cohen, retired ambassador, asks, when the Islamic Brotherhood is in power, are they able to engage in classic governance, or are they totally devoted to the Islamization of institutions? He has a second question. Has corruption arrived along with the authoritarian rule? So the problem of corruption, I don't think we talked about a lot today, but where do we stand on that? So John Hirsch from the Dawn organization, Democracy in the Arab World Now, says the suggestion of inviting Saied to participate in the Summit for Democracy follow-on activities, or to have him visit the White House while also acknowledging that he staged a coup, is baffling. What is the lesson? Have a coup and you get to meet with the president? And the military played a significant role in this coup by blocking parliament and disclosure, and through the continued military trials. It is helping to implement the coup, and to call it merely a self-coup is inaccurate. Mr. Muhammad Dia Hamami asks, the incentivization approach assumes that Saied is a hyper-rational actor who responds to incentives and disincentives in the classical utilitarian way. Aside from the rumors of neurodivergence, how do you think Saied has responded to internal or external incentives or disincentives so far? Mohammed Shanawi, journalist with Voice of America, asks, with the full engagement in the war in Ukraine, would the US or the EU pay any attention to Tunisia, let alone take any action? Question from Sabina Hennenberg to Sarah. Those carrots you are suggesting make a lot of sense. Is it possible to implement them quickly enough to get Saied to reverse course on the referendum? Is that what you are suggesting? I may have misunderstood. Okay, Mr. Herman Cohen also adds that Mugabe in Zimbabwe lost a constitutional referendum in 1998 that led to total dictatorship in Zimbabwe. Marco Stella asks, thanks to all the panelists for their insights, extremely enlightening. However, it seems to me there is very little possibility to twist Kais Saied's arm via economic sanction or aid cutting. On the contrary, the risk would be to further exasperate an already dire economic situation, which could bring the country towards social unrest and instability. And who would benefit from social unrests? Definitely not democracy. I would add, who would benefit from social rest? Definitely also not democracy. It would be dictatorship if there is no social or popular unrest and upheavals against dictatorship. Herman Cohen says Ben Ali had military support. Mohammed Shinawi asks again, how about the role of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE role in supporting the counter-revolution in Tunisia? And finally, Benjamin Dalton asks, please see my question in the chat section. Thank you. Okay, we'll go to the chat section next, but let's take your answers to these questions. Sharan, you want to go first?
Sure. Let me take the questions about the economic crisis in particular. So the other very persuasive argument against cutting aid or leveraging the IMF is that it might lead to social unrest, instability, and not to democracy long term. Sarah's solution is very clever, of shifting that aid directly to the people through CSOs, etc. That is one way to alleviate the grievances in the meantime. I think another route, though, is that the aid can be reinstated in phases, not all at once, but based on intermediate metrics, right? So for Saied to actually start a dialogue with not just the labor unions, but also the political parties and other CSOs. Just having the dialogue can release some of the aid. Agreeing to something in that dialogue could be another intermediate step. And then actually implementing whatever roadmap they agreed upon could be a third step that ultimately leads to the full resumption of aid. So I think you can carry it out in these intermediate steps to alleviate some of the economic impacts. The other point I would say is that the current conditions on the IMF loans, the ones that would require the subsidy cuts and other structural economic reforms, those are going to ultimately produce, in the short term, the social unrest and the instability. And so I would say replace those economic demands with these political ones would be the smarter term for the instability and the economic unrest.
Good, thank you. Sarah?
Sure, thanks. So I'll just respond quickly to the question about what I said was baffling. So the idea is that, if Saied unwinds the things that he has done, then you reward him. It's not preemptively reward and say, good job, you had a coup, you get to come to the White House. The idea is he's already done what he's done. Our goal, I believe, is to return Tunisia to democracy and to prevent him from going further, but also to unwind all the things he's already done. And so you offer explicit carrots for if you do X, you get Y. And again, that's sort of the point there. And similar to Sabine's question about, do we have enough time? I don't know if we have enough time, but I don't think we should use that as an excuse not to do something. I think the idea at this point, the most explicit immediate need is to prevent this constitution from codifying a lot of the things Saied has been doing. And so again, it's sort of a mixed carrot stick approach where you would say, if you need to have an actual inclusive dialogue, you need to allow all political parties and all actors in Tunisia to participate in that dialogue process. The same kinds of things that, we want to get to the point where we're not having this constitution come out and then it's going to be too late sort of enact this. So it's sort of a speed method, if you can, to try to get some of this stuff done.
Thank you. Shadi?
Yeah, so I think that, Marco's question is really good. And this is also what I think Sarah was rightly getting at, because I think this is, for those of us who are pushing for, let's say, a more proactive approach, we have to be able to contend with the concern of the dire economic consequences, and are we making it worse or are we making it better, and so on. But I actually think there's more of a common ground here between Sarah's approach and, say, Meyer Sharan's approach. And, maybe this is worth just clarifying a little bit a little more explicitly. And Sharan sort of got to this. It's not as if you unilaterally and spend something that you're done. The way you approach the lever can be modulated depending on the progress or lack of progress that you see. So if we do spend IMF talks, there would have to be clear conditions through which they would be reinstated. So almost by definition, if you introduce sticks, the removal of those sticks are effectively carrots. There's no really such thing as an only sticks approach. I'm just a little bit more skeptical of dish sweeteners, but I think that there would be reward if Kais Saied does return on a democratic path. And then you could reinstate portions of aid accordingly. But this is why all of this to be publicly outlined, because I don't trust the U.S. government to actually hold to any private promises it makes to a dictator. The U.S. doesn't really do that well. That's why the media, American organizations, people like us, we have to know what the public conditions are, so that way we can go back to our colleagues and counterparts in the State Department and DOD and say, listen, here was the public announcement, here were the benchmarks that you agreed to, are you meeting them or are you not? And that's why the public part of this, in my view, is so important.
Before I ask Larry to give us his answers, I want to add something here to the panel. I think it's very important. In my opinion, if we learned anything from the last 10 months, it is that Kais Saied is not capable of changing his mind, is not capable of changing course. You know, he is like a train that goes in only one direction, and at not a variable speed, at a constant speed, maybe accelerating speed. He has not shown in the last 10 months any willingness to change course under a lot of pressure, both internally and externally. So I think we really have to revise our approach, and we really basically have to give up on the idea that Kais Saied is going to change course. He is not going to change course, and therefore we need to find other solutions, but basically keep in mind that he's not going to change course. So what are we going to do about it, knowing that he's not going to change course? Larry?
Well, your statement, Radwan, is a partial response to one of the questions that was asked, basically about whether Kais Saied is a rational actor. And you're suggesting he's not. And so was the questioner, by the way, suggesting that. And I think that is actually one of the most interesting hypotheses that has been articulated here, that he's, you know, mentally not a completely well individual, to just put it bluntly, which is not unusual for authoritarian actors. I'm not comparing Saied, obviously, to Saddam Hussein, but if Saddam had been a rational actor, he would still be in power. And so, you know, there is a kind of messianic and megalomaniacal quality to many authoritarian leaders that put them beyond the practical manipulation of carrots and sticks in terms of moving them to where we want to get them to go. And my answer to this is, he's not Saddam Hussein, in a different sense that is more relevant to our discussion at the moment. He doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the full command of the system. He hasn't even come close to consolidating power in the way that an Assad or a Saddam or so on, or a Sisi now has done. And so I think we need very broad engagement with other power actors in Tunisian society. And then again, this is part of what I call the art and the pain of private diplomacy, that we need to engage with the other potential actors in the military and different administration to let them know what lie ahead. Tunisia goes in one direction rather than another. You know, I was tempted to say that the situation could be portrayed to the Tunisian military in such a way that could lead to a different course of history for Tunisia, and I'll just leave it at that. I want to answer a couple of questions that are in the chat, and then this will bring me to a final response to a couple of other questions that haven't been. My colleague at Stanford, Nate Grudden, asked, well, the IMF loan, Tunisia's really over a barrel now. I'm paraphrasing here. So this IMF decision is going to have to be made soon, and we won't know whether Tunisia is really sincerely headed on a path of return to democracy until much beyond when an IMF decision would be made. Sarah might be able to clarify this, but I think it's possible for the IMF to make a bridge loan that would be a temporary reprieve from disaster and real structural funds. That is, I think, the moment truth could be postponed while his intentions are tested. And then the point in Alton is similar to a question that was posed by Ahmed Shinawi about the other actors in the region, obviously in particular Saudi Arabia, UAE, and whether, how they fit into this, since they have worked so assiduously to try and first preempt and undermine the success of Arab Spring political changes, and then probably help encourage the rolling back of it in Tunisia. And sad reality is, none of these are power actors. Tunisia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are going to be the least bit helpful. And let's not have any illusions. Whatever leverage we have with Saudi Arabia now, it's going to be used to get it to pump more oil, to put onto oil markets, given the crisis now with Russia's war on Ukraine. And there's not going to be any political leverage left over to try and get it to behave more responsibly with regard to Asia, which it would do anyway. So, we just got to rally their actors here. I wanted to respond finally to one last question that was posed, I think, to Alex Sutton, also in the chat, was this vision that Kais Saied has of no-party democracy, and whether that could be consistent with democracy. And I just want to say, both from philosophical and almost logical grounds, but also prior historical grounds, there is just no logical reason to think, and no historical evidence to suggest that banning political parties can produce anything resembling a meaningful democracy. You're already, precluding the principal instrument by which democratic competition is organized and fielded, and violating, I'd say, a basic political right, which is the right to form political parties. And if you do that, the evidence suggests that authoritarian manipulation always follows in its wake.
Okay. We are basically out of time, but let me see if there's any more urgent questions in the chat section. Okay, you answered, Larry, a couple of questions already. Let's see. So a question from Said. Failed democracy in the Arab world is supposed to be the responsibility of Western democracies, as people are convinced that Arab governments are managed and supported by Western countries, especially poor countries where governments are supported by US and European financial aids. Why shouldn't democracy be a must for financial help for these countries? The reason I read this question is this question, I think, is on the minds of a lot of people in Tunisia. The US and European Union keep talking about promoting human rights and democracy, but we're supporting dictators all over the world, especially in the region. And people are really astonished. They see this as a contradiction. You want to support democracy, but you're justifying giving money to dictators, in this case to Kais Saied, following a coup on democracy. We're still justifying that we need to still give him money because, for whatever reason. or give financial and military support. So a lot of Tunisia are saying, and the world in general, or the MENA region in general, if you're supporting dictators, it means you're supporting dictatorship. You can't be supporting dictators and democracy at the same time. There is clear contradictions not even ambiguity, but really contradiction. Supporting dictators, especially after a coup, and sanctifying, and sometimes we're not calling the coup, that you don't want to coup because you don't want to antagonize them, or I guess in case of Tunisia, because it wasn't clear at the beginning that it was a coup. So why can't the US and the European Union be more clear in their support of democracy, be more assertive, and they will gain so much credibility, in Tunisia and in the MENA region, in the Arab world, if we take a different position that, look, if you do this, we are not going to support you anymore. It's as simple as that. I think we did that, by the way, at the end with Ben. That's why he fell at the end. He lost all kinds of support from the US and the EU, and including from the Tunisian military at the end, and that's why he fell. But this ambiguity in our position, that, we support democracy, but yet we are dealing with dictators in a way that sends a different message. I don't know. I mean, it'd be a complicated question, but I wonder if you have any answer. People in Tunisia right now are starting to understand really what is the position of the United States, what is the position of the European Union, why we condemn dictatorship, but we're still giving money to a dictatorship.
Ridwan, if I could jump
Yes.
in on this point. And I think it's really great that you brought this up, because we're not really just talking about Tunisia here.
Exactly.
We're talking about an entire orientation in U.S. foreign policy that lasted decades. And this is why, look, we do what we do. We try to push the needle a little bit, but ultimately I'm pessimistic, because for the U.S. to actually care about democracy in Tunisia, it gets a much bigger strategic question. It's about the whole regional architecture in the Middle East. Our regional architecture as Americans has been designed around authoritarian regimes. This is not something you can change overnight. It's accumulated over time, and we've kept on doubling down on this strategy. So I would hope that we can be better on Tunisia now, but it's a small part of a much bigger problem that, in my view, has to be addressed. That the youth hasn't just been a bystander. It has not been neutral. It has been an active participant in sustaining authoritarian structures in most of the Middle East. I think we have to be very frank about that. And I think that the author answered your question, Ridwan, which I think is fortunate. But, and these are people I talk to on a regular basis. I think many of them are well-meaning. But I actually think that many senior officials in the Biden administration, this is also true for the Obama administration a year ago, I don't think they believe in democracy in the Middle East. And it's very hard for someone like me to come in and persuade them, because it really comes down to a fundamentally different way of looking at global politics. And, we try our best to make the case and to explain it. And I think there are positive voices in the administration who can perhaps bring the argument more effectively. But this is really, it's about a whole way of doing business in the Middle East that has been bipartisan, that goes back many, many decades. My hope is that for younger policymakers and those who might play a bigger role in the future, they can't just tinker around the margins. They have to completely reconceptualize America's relationship with the Middle East. It's not easy. It's risky. We want to support democracy. If we think democracy is the best thing for America's long-term interest, which I think it is, it may not be the best thing for our short-term interest. We might have to deal with some destabilization. You can't have your cake and eat it. there are trade-offs in life just as there is in policy. But ultimately, there's a bigger question here that we have to think about more seriously.
Thank you, Shadi. Any final closing remarks from the rest of the panel? John?
Sure. I would just say two things quickly. One is that the U.S., to its credit, has been much better on this issue than Europe. Partially suspending aid now, the public statements have been very critical relative to Europe, which has been a bit slower, more concerned about refugees, more concerned about instability. And I think the message needs to be sent that what is going to cause instability, refugees, even security threats, is banning parties, moving to an authoritarian system that provides no ability to channel dissent through the system. That is the recipe for instability and violence. The second point I want to say is your point earlier about is he a rational actor? I think what we have learned in the last 10 months is that there is one thing he cares about a lot, and that is this political project of creating a new republic. He doesn't care that much about the economy. He's delegating that to the prime minister, central bank governor, etc. But he does care about this consultation for a new constitution, a referendum that the Tunisian public doesn't care about, but he does. So that gives you an opportunity to find a way to satisfy his cost-benefit calculus as well as support democracy, which is that we need to give him, as I said in the start, an off-ramp, a way that he still gets his new republic, a new constitution, but the process of creating that new constitution is one that's inclusive. All the parties are involved. In essence, the new constitution they create is the 2014 constitution with some improvements. For instance, removing the clause on the state of emergency that led to this whole crisis in the first place.
Sharan, his project for the new republic is fundamentally at odds with the principles of democracy and with the the values of democracy. He wants basically a Jamahiriya, like Gaddafi, with very good system that he wants. How can you reconcile these two projects?
He has already compromised on that by agreeing to parliamentary elections. The original system was local elections only, and they would send a delegate to the National Assembly. So that suggests that he is willing to compromise a bit on what that new system would look like, and potentially would allow for this win-win scenario where he comes out justifying to his base that yes, I created a new republic, but all the other parties are also on board that this new republic is one that's going to be democratic. So that's what I'm hoping for, that through the maximum pressure that we're discussing that the U.S. could put, that you'll get those initial dialogues now between Kais Saied and the party, that you'll get that nice constitution that then gets passed in July.
Thank you.
Can I just say, I want to disagree with Shadi's point that the U.S. administration doesn't care about democracy in the Middle East. Specifically, don't give it that's true. I don't think that was true with Tunisia prior to the Arab Spring. The amount of assistance, the amount of attention, it may not have been sufficient, but it dramatically increased. Look at this approach in July 2020. Been very public about saying that, but I think what we saw was U.S. prior to July 25th, there was very little U.S. attention on Tunisia. What we have seen was the Deputy National Security Advisor go over there. We saw multiple calls with the Secretary of State. We saw the U.S., a lot of stuff also happening that we have not seen publicly, a lot of stuff privately where the U.S. has been very vocal. Again, the rhetorical stuff has not worked, but they're very vocal about the fact that they care about democracy. We care about Tunisia because we care about democracy in Tunisia. And I think that it's to say that the people who are currently working on Tunisia and the administration do not care about democracy is just blatantly false.
Okay, but Sarah, look, what you precisely said, they're vocal. That's precisely the criticism. That is rhetoric. It is not content. It is not substantive. And I don't deny that we would prefer to have democracy, all other things being equal, but all other things aren't equal. Our officials will support democracy if there is no cost, if there is no risk to stability in scare quotes, then yes, they'll go along with it because there's no difficulty involved. But anytime something else is on the chopping board or it might affect some other narrow national security interest, democracy or political reform is always put on the cutting block. And don't even get me started on the Obama administration, which played a central role in perpetuation of the authoritarian architecture in the Middle East. And we don't have to talk about the moral stain after the massacre in Egypt, but this is very dark stuff. And I don't think we can even, I think to say that the Obama administration cared about democracy in the Middle East after that initial 6 months.
I said in Tunisia.
Yeah. Okay, but I was making a bigger argument about the entire regional architecture. It is impossible to say the U.S. cares actually about democracy in the Middle East. If they did, we wouldn't have seen all the moral stains of the past 20 to 30, 40 years.
I think we're opening a much bigger question and bigger topic for discussion that probably will be the subject of many seminars and webinars to come. Larry, any final comments, ideas?
Because I know we really need to close. First of all, I want to thank you, and again, my fellow panelists. I just think, even with the back and forth and agreement and the nuances of agreement and disagreement, it's just been a tremendous exchange. I've really gained so much from it. And second of all, this is my final substantive point, and I hope it can be conveyed to the Biden administration, because this is obvious. Time is of the essence. Mm-hmm. In two respects. Number one, the economic situation and the impending possibility of a default or a complete economic collapse, but also the political situation. It's been said repeatedly, and I think it should be emphasized in conclusion, that if he goes ahead and drafts a blatantly undemocratic constitution and then shoves it through in a blatantly undemocratic election, it'll be like concrete settling. It'll be very hard to reverse. So even though most of there's only so much diplomatic creativity and bandwidth in any presidential administration in the U.S., and a lot of it's focused on Russia and Ukraine now, and the rest of it is focused right now on East Asia, the Pacific region, the Quad, and the deterring of China. But I think the one thing we can all agree on is that the next 2 months are absolutely critical, and we really need to press the Biden administration in partnership with the EU to try to that there is democratic dialogue and hopefully more time, more inclusion in the process to go forward.
Thank you, Larry. I really want to echo Larry's comments that this has been a terrific panel, definitely one of the best panels we've had in the last year on this topic. Thank you all very much for your input, ideas, and suggestions. It's a difficult topic, but I think we all agree that Tunisia should get more attention from the Biden administration, and that the next 2 months are going to be critical in terms of saving Tunisia and saving Tunisia's democracy. So I hope that the Biden administration is listening to this panel and to this advice, and we will try to communicate with them some of the ideas and recommendations of this panel. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today. It's been a terrific panel. And thank you to all the panelists as well as all the participants for all your excellent questions. And sorry we didn't have time to cover all the questions, but hopefully we'll have more discussions in the future. Thank you all very much, and have an enjoyable